Hi, and welcome to a pre-recorded version of a presentation that I'm going to give at the Conference on Aid and Development in Dunedin this month, September 2025. My name is Terence Wood. This is a pre-recorded version of the lecture. Please be aware that if you're watching this, the slides that I deliver on the day and the presentation itself may differ slightly from this pre-recorded version. Without further ado, I am going to share my slides. So this presentation, Thinking into a Turbulent Sea, New Zealand Aid in a Rapidly Changing World. So I'm going to talk briefly in this presentation first about aid itself. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Then I'm going to talk about what on earth is happening to foreign aid globally. Then I'm going to change focus a bit and talk about aid in the Pacific. Then I'm going to change tack again and start talking about New Zealand aid. Is it important? We're a small country, small donor. Does our aid really matter? Then I'm going to talk about some issues associated with New Zealand aid. Then finally, I'm going to provide some advice for New Zealand policymakers and politicians about what we should be doing in this crucial moment for international development. So on both the left and the right, aid has had its detractors. Many different claims have been made about the harms that aid do. So some people have said that aid's neo-colonial. Other people have said that aid distorts markets. Both on the left and right, people have claimed that aid fosters dependence. These are all interesting critiques, but the reality of aid is much more complex. The first thing that you need to know about aid is that compared to the size of most countries' economies, as you can see on this chart. Each bar on the chart's a country. Some countries are coloured in blue. We'll return to them in a second. The height of each country's bar reflects the amount of aid it gets compared to the size of its economy. And you can see the median country on Earth in 2022, aid was about 2.7% of gross national income in that country. And that is a pretty small amount of money. Never mind the East India Company, you just can't colonize much with this small volume of aid. Similarly, if you're worried about aid distorting markets, well, a trivial amount of money like this just isn't going to distort much. So aid really, it's hard to see how aid could fit some of the most sweeping allegations about its negative effects. This quote here, reiterating a point that I have just made, but this author has made it very nicely, I think. So the author says that critics of aid have pointed out that aid hasn't eliminated poverty, but it would be crazy to expect annual global aid, which is equivalent to the GDP of New Zealand. We'll all be familiar with just how small New Zealand is. It would be crazy to expect that aid, which is of such a small magnitude, to catapult the 5 billion people who live on for less than $4,000 a year into a life of prosperity. Compared to the magnitude of the task that confronts foreign aid, compared to the size of the countries where it's given, in most parts of the world, aid is really quite trivial. Despite that, if you look at the data, you can see that you would expect to be able to see some fingerprint of foreign aid on development indicators. So it's not going to be determinative, but aid ought to, in aggregate, play a positive or a negative role. And lots of econometricians have tried to look for this sort of relationship. And my read of the econometric evidence at present is that, if anything, aid tends to have a positive relationship with key development indicators. Commensurate with the fact that aid is a pretty small flow of capital, the positive effects are typically found to be pretty small. The econometrics involved in testing these sorts of relationships is complex, and the findings are contested. To make matters worse, most data involved in these sort of tests are poor. And although I find the findings somewhat persuasive, despite some of these limitations, it's worth noting that the studies typically are focused on the average effects of foreign aid on different development outcomes. And averages hide a lot when it comes to aid. Here's a diagram I made trying to plot all the different pathways that aid can take from donor countries to poor people living in aid recipient countries. And you can see from this chart, I'm not going to go through it arrow by arrow, but you can see that aid is a really complex phenomenon. There are many, many different ways of giving aid, and there are many different things that can make some donors' aid better and some donors' aid worse. Broadly put, it doesn't make much sense to talk about the average impact of foreign aid on development. And what we can see once we pull apart the averages is when we look at individual programs and the effects, we find some incredible successes associated with foreign aid. So the elimination of smallpox, the impact of antiretrovirals, you can see on this chart on HIV, particularly in Africa, impact of aid in reducing malaria, provision of vaccinations thanks to foreign aid. So aid really has some major successes that can be attributed to it. On the other hand, if you look at the track record of foreign aid over the decades, you also find some catastrophic failures. And I think the most striking of these is always the aid provided to Mobutu as a dictator in Zaire during the Cold War. It was provided to him ostensibly for the sake of promoting development, but mostly for the sake of keeping him out of the hands of the Soviet Union. And what did he do with this money? Well, he either squandered it or stole it. And Zaire was left in debt to donors who typically lent the money as a result. So if you look at the history of aid, you can find some catastrophic failures that are coupled with the really significant successes that can be attributed to aid. So to summarize what I've just said, really, in many countries, aid's just not that important, at least not that important in determining their overall level of development. Aid's also marred by national interests, donors giving aid to advance their own national interests. You can see this most strikingly in the first Cold War, although it's a problem again now. Aid is also a human endeavor. It suffers from all of our flaws. So you sometimes read anthropological studies of aid in action, and these anthropologists will highlight all sorts of flaws in the way aid is given. Well, some of these flaws just stem from the fact that humans are a flawed species, and nothing we ever do is perfect. Despite all this, aid can help. And when it's given well, foreign aid can help a lot. It may not determine the fate of nations, but the right type of aid given for the right type of things with the right type of motives really can improve individuals' lives a lot. So aid does matter. I want to turn to something else right now, and it's got all to do with human flaws. And in particular, now I'm going to speak about the impact of aid cuts. If I had time, I'd like to speak about this chap and his cuts to UK aid, Keir Starmer. I'm not a fan of him, but I'm going to focus first and foremost in these next few slides on cuts to US aid because they've been dominating the newspaper headlines. So it's hard to know exactly how severe the cuts are going to be to US aid. It's a kind of winding process that involves negotiations between the Trump administration and Congress. However, we do know that there's going to be a big fall. And this chart shows my colleague Robin Davies' estimates of what is likely to happen to global aid flows in coming years. And what you can see here is that aid is set to fall a lot and fall rapidly. And that is thanks primarily to falls in US aid, although falling German aid and falling English aid is not helping matters. So let's focus on the US for a bit. So the US is not a generous donor, but it's also has a very big economy. So it's the world's largest donor country. And the very nature of the incredibly sudden pause in aid and subsequent cuts to US aid have detonated aid infrastructure, US aid infrastructure the world over. And that's been a source of chaos and has prevented a lot of aid that's still been provided by the US from actually reaching its intended recipients. USAID got dissolved as well. You'll all recall it wasn't perfect, but it really did house some development expertise and it was the home to a number of people who are really committed to promoting international development. Aid has now been delivered by the US State Department. It doesn't have many of these things. It also doesn't have enough staff to spend the remaining budgeted US aid. So a lot of aid that's still on the budget in the US, it still says it's going to give, just isn't flowing right now and is unlikely to flow before the end of their financial year. Thanks to some Republicans in Congress, some health programs that the US has given, some very successful health programs such as PEPFAR, have been preserved for the time being, although it is unclear how long these programs will last into the future. And perhaps the most significant thing to do with the cuts at this point in time, the thing that's going to be relevant as we talk about the Pacific and New Zealand, is that the Trump administration has made massive cuts to the aid provided to some important multilateral organizations. And these are organizations tasked with providing public goods. And if they fall apart, it'll be a major global issue. Just finally on the slide, I have a quote. I find it hard to read, to be honest, and it's to do with the ramifications of cuts to US humanitarian aid to the Sudan, which of course is in a civil war right now. Here's the quote. When US-supported soup kitchens in Sudan were forced to close, I should say it comes from a Washington Post article, when US-supported soup kitchens in Sudan were forced to close, babies starved quietly, their mothers said, while their older siblings died begging for food. Funding stoppages also meant that crucial medical supplies were never delivered, the doctors said. So the lack of US-funded disease response teams has also made it harder to control cholera outbreaks, which are claiming the lives of those already weakened by hunger. This quote brings home, I hope, that these facts, these aid cuts aren't some sort of abstract things, aren't just lines on a chart, aren't another naughty thing that Donald Trump is doing. They're cuts that are killing people in developing countries. So what does all this mean for the Pacific then? What are the impacts of US aid cuts likely to be on Pacific countries? Well, the Pacific is the world's most aid-dependent region. Compared to the size of the Pacific countries' economies, or compared to the size of their populations, aid is much higher in most Pacific countries than it is in most other countries globally. So at present, or in 2022, which is the year for which the most recently available data exists, Pacific countries were more dependent on aid, and some of the Pacific countries were the most aid-dependent countries on Earth. Only one Pacific country is lower than the global median, and that's Papua New Guinea. Now, you might be wondering, well, why are Pacific countries so dependent on aid? Why is aid so large compared to the size of their economies or compared to the size of their populations? Is it something wrong with Pacific Islanders, for example? Actually, the reality is much more prosaic. There's a clear global relationship between the size of developing countries and the volume of aid they get on a per capita basis. Pacific countries fit with this relationship very nicely, but it's not a relationship that's solely driven by the Pacific. So if you're wondering why Pacific countries are so aid dependent, it's because they're small, and smaller countries tend to get larger volumes of aid compared to their size globally. We can talk about why that might be the case in question time if you're interested. For the time being, though, just recall that aid per capita or aid compared to the size of the country's economy is high in the Pacific, simply because the countries of the Pacific are small, and to some degree because many of them are also remote. Let's return now to the US, though. So what is going to happen to US aid in the Pacific? Is it important? Well, you can see the 10 largest donors to the Pacific region, once again, based on 2022 data, that are the most recent data available. Each bar on the chart is a donor. The height of each bar reflects how much aid the donor gives to the region. First thing you might want to notice is, despite the scare stories, China is not it's not the biggest donor in the Pacific. That title goes to Australia, which is by far and away the largest donor to the Pacific. The next two next two donors based on 2022 data are multilateral organizations, the ADB and the World Bank. Now, these numbers are sort of artificially high. 2022 was something of an unusual year for these donors. Typically, they're down here closer to the second tier of donors. And you look at the second tier of donors, well, you see that the United States is a significant donor to the Pacific, along with New Zealand, whom we will return to. However, most of the United States aid flows to the so-called compact states. That is Marshall Islands, FSM, and Palau. And most of that aid ought to be protected by law. Of course, the Trump administration doesn't seem to be that attached to the law of the land in the United States. So there may ultimately be cuts to aid to the compact states. But the impact of US aid cuts is likely, the most major impacts are likely first and foremost to be confined to these countries. The rest of the Pacific won't be that significantly impacted by US aid cuts, except that there are some important aid programs that are run by the US in the Pacific. So I think antiretrovirals and PNG are likely to be cut, and this will have a negative impact on people with HIV in Papua New Guinea. So you can find some important programs, and their cuts or disruption to these programs will be felt. Probably even more important to that, though, will be the flow and effects of US aid cuts to multilateral organizations. If crucial multilateral organizations really start falling apart or have to scale back their operations globally, you will find some flow-on effects into the Pacific. So quite a few global multilateral organizations aren't that major donors to Pacific countries, but they do still provide some crucial public goods. So this will be one way that US aid cuts have a negative impact on the Pacific. In the meantime, cuts aside, all manner of other challenges are going to confront Pacific countries. Some of these challenges are going to get worse, particularly challenges associated with climate change. Remember that the Trump administration in the US doesn't even think climate change is a real problem. They want to burn, baby, burn. And that's going to accentuate the impacts of climate change that are felt in Pacific countries. Then there will be perennial problems that will continue to plague the Pacific, some of the development problems associated with being small and remote, governance issues in Western Pacific countries such as Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands. And then, as many of you will have noticed, there is a new Cold War going on in the Pacific. The West and China are jostling for influence, and that's going to make the lives of Pacific countries more difficult too. So there are a suite of problems that are confronting the Pacific at present. Some of them are old, some of them are new, and there will be some problems associated with US aid cuts, although they probably aren't the most important problems confronting Pacific countries at present. So that's the Pacific out of the way. Given that we're all here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, let's now chat for a little bit about New Zealand aid. First thing, you're probably all aware of this, but New Zealand doesn't make a large sacrifice when our government gives foreign aid. And this is data for 2025-26 financial year, out of every $100 of government spending or core government spending in New Zealand, $99.28 is spent on New Zealand. Only 72 cents out of $100 is spent on foreign aid. So we don't sacrifice much when we give foreign aid. We're not a generous donor by global standards, and because we're a small country, small economy, we're also a trivial donor globally. But we do have a very heavy focus on the Pacific, and so we are a major donor in the one region of the world where aid flows really are pretty large compared to the size of countries' economies and their population. So New Zealand aid matters in a part of the world where aid matters a lot. Something else that's worth noting, just because New Zealand focuses a lot of aid in the Pacific, is that based on other donors' data, New Zealand does have data of a similar form to the data we've been able to analyze for other donors, but they don't make it public. Based on other donors' data, it seems as if aid projects tend to perform worse on average in the Pacific than elsewhere. So the Pacific's very aid dependent. It also seems to be a hard place to give aid effectively. With colleagues, I've dug into why this is the case, and it turns out that it's not a fault of Pacific Islanders or even typically their governments. It just turns out that it's hard to give aid in countries where the geography is unfavorable, small and remote countries, in particular, or countries like Papua New Guinea, where there is a lot of internal remoteness. So if you want to give aid to the Pacific and you want that aid to work, you've got to try particularly hard to adapt your aid to the context of the countries of the region. So what then is happening to New Zealand aid? Well, let's start with the positive. The New Zealand aid program won't give me all the data I'd like to have on aid performance, but it is more transparent now. It has improved aid transparency somewhat. The capacity of the aid program, however, in terms of expertise and the way it fosters expertise in delivering aid amongst its staff, has never really recovered since the demise of NZ Aid. So the capacity, its capability to deliver aid effectively is not that high. Coupled with this, MFAT isn't really a learning organization when it comes to the way that it gives foreign aid. It doesn't engage in research in the way that DFAT does, and it doesn't do as much as it could to learn from its evaluations to try and build institutional knowledge, and particularly when it comes to institutional knowledge, its understanding of the aid that New Zealand gives to the Pacific and country context in the Pacific. And this is important because we should be learning about the countries. We should know as much as possible about the countries that we give foreign aid to, and we should be learning from our mistakes. If you do that, your aid's more likely to work. And it's something that you really need to do in Pacific countries because it seems like aid is less likely to work in the Pacific. And sadly, rather than focusing on fostering a culture of learning and spending money on learning more about its aid, New Zealand, like everyone else, seems to be currently quite caught up in the new Cold War in the Pacific. So we're expending a lot of effort and we're thinking a lot when we design our aid programs about trying to work with other Western powers to diminish China's influence in the region. And the problem with that is if you're thinking about something else rather than making your aid work as well as possible, you're going to find yourself distracted from delivering aid that effectively promotes development. Now, having said all that, having made these complaints, it is worth noting that there are still development experts floating around MFAT, some people who really do have expertise in delivering aid and also in working in the Pacific. However, these people are scattered far. These people are scattered far and wide. However, there are some people who do really know about giving aid well. And if you look around the Pacific, you can find examples of New Zealand-funded aid projects that have been done well and have had positive impacts. This photo is of one project that I know pretty well from my time in Port Moresby. This is Gordon's Market. And the aid project, New Zealand helped rebuild Gordon's Market, and it did so in an intelligent way, thinking about issues such as gender. And the results have been really quite positive, both for people who shop at Gordon's Market, like me, but also for the women who work in Gordon's Market selling food there. So New Zealand does still give some good aid despite all its flaws. And all told, if I were to hazard a guess, I'd say that the net impact of New Zealand aid on the Pacific is still positive. Could be much higher still if we gave aid better, but we're still probably doing more good than harm in the Pacific, this region of the world that's so where aid is so significant. Having tried to finish that last slide with a positive point, one other thing that I'd like to note about New Zealand aid is that we're not a good global citizen in terms of the aid that we give multilateral organizations. This chart, each bar on this chart is an OECD DAC donor. The height of each bar reflects the share of the aid that they give as non-earmarked core funding to multilateral organizations. Data from 2022, and you'll see that New Zealand is right at the wrong end of this chart, right down the bottom, accompanied by the United States, in case you're interested. we really are a free rider when it comes to strengthening and contributing to multilateral organizations. It's true that the volume of aid that we give as a whole is pretty small, so the negative impacts associated with our free riding probably aren't huge. But as a matter of principle, we really should be trying to help the global multilateral system. And we don't. We're really an outlier, a negative outlier in this sense. So those are a few comments about New Zealand aid, the quality of New Zealand aid, what we spend it on, what we don't spend it on. Now let's talk about the future of New Zealand aid. And let's focus here first up on aid volumes. You can see that our foreign aid rose pretty rapidly under the Ardern administration. However, since then, since the change of government, New Zealand aid volumes have started to fall again, and fall again at a pretty rapid pace. What's going on here? Well, a lot of this is to do with climate aid. Climate aid is aid that we give as part of our overall climate finance contributions, money that's designed to help developing countries either mitigate their own emissions, or most importantly, with regards to New Zealand aid and also with regards to the Pacific, money that we give to help them adapt to the impacts of climate change. Thanks to the Green Party, probably to some MFAT officials too, the climate aid that we had been giving increased very rapidly under the last Labour government. This was a good thing. It fit with the spirit of the international promises that we have made to give new and additional money to help countries adapt to climate change. So money on top of the money that we already give to try ostensibly to try and promote development. We started giving new and additional aid to help fund climate adaptation under the Ardern government. However, since then, our aid budget overall has started to fall, and this, one would expect, would also be bringing down the nominal volume of climate aid that New Zealand's giving. However, countries are expected to report on their climate finance contributions to the United Nations, and it would be really embarrassing if New Zealand had to go to these global fora and say, look, sorry, you guys, that's a bit embarrassing, but we've got tax cuts to fund. So we're now going to give countries less to help them adapt to the urgent problem of climate change. That would be really embarrassing. Fortunately for the government, they've come up with a solution. We are going to cook the books. Specifically, New Zealand is going to pretend in the future that all of its bilateral foreign aid is climate related. We do that, then that will prevent the volume of the climate aid that we give, the nominal volume that we say we give, we do that will prevent that number from falling. Of course, it's a ridiculous promise. We can't, in a short period of time, recalibrate our aid program so that there is a significant focus in all our bilateral aid projects on climate-related issues. Just not possible. So we're talking about an accounting exercise here. Even if it was possible, would we really want to do that? Climate's important, but climate aid is meant to be new and additional on top of the aid that we're already giving, recognizing the importance of aid in addressing other issues in addition to climate-related ones. But we're too tight-fisted to give new and additional climate aid, so we're just going to pretend that all our other aid is climate-related, so we don't have to go through that embarrassing process of telling the UN that we're not giving much climate aid, and the amount of climate aid that we're giving is falling. Australia's trying something similar. They're not being nearly as brazen about it, but my colleague Alyssa Lang and I have studied the effects of this accounting exercise as it's manifest in Australia, and we've found that it's had some negative unintended consequences. There's a reference to our paper and details on our paper at the in the reference section at the end of these slides if you want to read more. So New Zealand's not a great aid donor. There's issues such as capacity, there's issues such as the fact that we're caught up now in the new Cold War in the Pacific, but we do still give some good aid. Alas, though, we're not a generous aid donor. We shirk our obligations to the multilateral system, and even though we don't sacrifice much when we give foreign aid, our aid is falling. And because our aid is falling, really that should lead to a fall in the climate finance that we're giving. But that would be embarrassing to admit, so we're going to cook the books to make it seem like we give more climate aid than we actually do. Well, so in a great state of affairs, what could we do about it? Well, one thing we could do is just be honest with the Pacific and say that, no, we do pretend to be your friends. We do pretend to be good neighbors when it's in our interest and when we're wanting to prevent you from cozying up to China. But really, at the end of the day, first and foremost, we care about ourselves. This ruse of friendship is nothing more than pretense. We could be honest about it. That would be one thing we could do. There's something even better than we could. There's something else, though, that we could do, which would be even better. We could boost our aid budget and continue to boost it so that we were giving genuinely new and additional climate aid, giving money on top of the aid that we give for development purposes and focusing that money on helping Pacific countries adapt to the impacts of climate aid. We could also boost our aid, or should boost our aid budget to help give more to multilateral organizations during this time of crisis. Okay, we're not a huge donor, but we should be playing our part in trying to preserve the multilateral institutions, given that the world's largest donor is trying to detonate them, trying to tear them apart. We should also chill out about China a little bit. They ain't going to invade New Zealand. Their presence in the Pacific is not a healthy thing, but focusing on China all the time undermines the quality of our aid, and it's really not fair to treat Pacific countries as if they're just pawns on a geostrategic chessboard. We should also invest in the expertise that cultivate expertise in our aid program, and we should cultivate expertise in delivering aid on the Pacific. We should work hard to complement that through a learning process so that we're best enabled to give aid in the Pacific effectively. We should listen to Pacific people. We should conduct better evaluations so we can learn from our mistakes. And we should try and optimize the quality of our aid that we give in the world's most aid-dependent region. We've summarized all these things in a slide with about 5 bullet points. Doing this wouldn't be hard, although I'm not optimistic that we will do it. On that cheerful note, I'm going to finish my talk by taking questions, also going to provide listeners with some resources that they can access. Haven't got the links at present because those resources aren't finished. Thank you very much for your attention.